as your shoes click against the road, all around you you hear the buzzing and whirling of machines, wonders of the modern age, made of iron and heat. Factories litter the roadsides, steam pouring from every exhaust pipe. Wheels screech to a halt in a nearby train station. The modern age has truly arrived. Now, this might seem like a scene from 1800s London, but this very well could have been the Roman Empire way back in 300 AD, 1500 years before. Now, it's debatable, but sometime around 10 to 70 AD, Heron of Alexandria created the first machine that used steam power. Now, this was just a small contraption that used heated water to make a little thing spin. I'll put up a picture of it on screen now. This was mostly just used as a party trick to show people. It wasn't really seen as a serious invention that could have changed the world in any meaningful way. While now, over 1,000 years in the future, we see that this could have easily become the most important invention ever. Now, we must think to ourselves, why isn't it this massive important invention that changed the world, and is instead a small obscure topic that kids in their closets recording videos are going to make hundreds of years in the future? Well, number one, which is by far the most important, is it has no economic incentive. Slavery was by far the most profitable and most present way that Roman farms or any kind of industry worked. It was all based around slavery. In a society with a heavy presence of slavery, you cannot have industrialization. Why? Because I don't need my workers to be more effective and make more products in the same amount of time if I'm not paying them anyway. Because it's not taking any pocket out of my money if I just don't take the time and resources into making a more effective way, and instead just have them work for free for me with no issues. So that means for any society to have industrialization, they must first get rid of slavery, which is going to be a point we need to hit. The next one is, in general, these kind of things were not emphasized in Roman society, especially around this time, which is going to be like year 200-ish, that beforehand we're starting. Rome was very conservative, they weren't very machine-oriented, and things in this kind of field wouldn't have been pushed for very hard. And the next one is, to get a very effective industrial revolution, you would need a society with a pretty solid understanding of physics and a very strong capitalist setup in their society, neither of which Rome had. Around this time, you had some very good scientists, but none particularly in the field of physics, and of course modern day capitalism in its current sense would come about much later in England and that kind of medieval area where it really starts to take hold rather than ancient Rome. So Rome didn't have the best conditions by any means to take advantage of such an early advanced discovery, which is why it faded into obscurity. But here we can have most things up until 193 AD, when Septimus Severus became Roman emperor. From here we can have the following civil war after he took control happen more or less the same way. Him, being able to crush those other powers and take complete control. And we can say that around the time of the early 200s, very early 200s, more or less 202 AD to 203 AD, there was a very big growing Christian community in northern Africa. And Septimus Severus responded to that in a kind of fearful way, where he wasn't sure if Christianity would have kept spreading, which it definitely would have, so he took a very harsh stance towards it to try to keep it isolated, and created many martyrs, killed a lot of people in North Africa. This scenario is going to diverge by, instead of him seeing it as a problem that needed to be fixed, he could instead respond by saying that it would be the future and accepting it more into Roman culture. Now, this is going to be very unpopular with nobility, as many Romans hated Christianity, especially because it was so peaceful. And of course, Rome was based around war and constantly expanding to keep it functioning as a society. So something like Christianity would be very looked down upon. But if we can see Septimus Severus making it the official religion of the Roman Empire over 100 years before it did in our own timeline, we could see something like the Industrial Revolution have a much stronger chance of actually taking place. If it became the primary religion of the Roman Empire at this time, the Bible's teachings, of course, support equality for all people, which would mean very quickly slavery would get outlawed in the Roman Empire, especially because this is a type of Christianity much earlier in Roman history and in just general global history, where it had not spread out as much. And in general, as Christianity spreads out in history, it becomes less and less extreme, so it can appeal to more and more people. But at this time, where it's only 200 years, or a little bit less, since Jesus has died, it's still going to be very extreme and really, really focused on these principles, like getting rid of slavery, which then would naturally make slavery be outlawed in the Roman Empire. Now, like I said, slavery was a key fundamental principle of Roman society. So by doing this, he is going to ruffle a lot of feathers. A lot of people are going to be very angry at him, and we can see many, many places begin revolting because of this. We can see senatorial Italy begin revolting, probably southern Gaul, parts of Hispania, Carthage, Sicily, and likely Egypt. All of these places either had like olives, which were very labor-intensive crops to grow, had massive like grain or transport needed, like Egypt, where slaves were very heavily used in that, or Sicily, where there had been a lot of slaves revolt and a lot of conflict between slave owners and slaves, so we would likely see some places like that have a lot of conflict. Now, to get an idea of who Septimus Severus was and how he would handle this, he came out of Pannonia Superior, which was a border province in Rome. Because it was a border province, it was constantly being attacked by one tribe or another, which meant troops and legionnaires from this place had to be the toughest, most effective, leading Septimus Severus to be this very harsh, very strong leader and a very good tactician, military leader. To put it in perspective, he would likely be, when it comes to purely tactically speaking, better than Marcus Aurelius, but a little bit not as good as Trajan. And of course, that's going to make some people upset, as a lot of people love Marcus Aurelius, and saying that Septimus Severus would have been a better general than him, a lot of people are going to disagree with that. But when you're speaking in a strictly general sense, he was a better commander. While speaking as a nation leader sense, it was of course Marcus Aurelius. The best parallel I could give this, it would be that if somebody knows about the Civil War, it would be like saying Septimus Severus is more like Robert E. Lee, where if I had a battle or war necessarily I wanted him to win, I would give it to him. But let's say Marcus Aurelius is more like General Grant, where if I had a campaign and I wanted my nation to remain stable after the war and have a better idea of the whole picture, that would be more like Marcus Aurelius. So in a situation like this, where all of Rome is revolting, and the only thing I'm prioritizing is the continuation of Rome, I would say Septimus Severus would be fairly good at this job. From here, we can see immediately the senatorial revolt being put down in Italy. Septimus Severus was very well known for his suppression of the Senate, so he would have no issues going into Rome and just crucifying all of the senators who were in revolt, using big fear tactics to make sure that that is put down very quickly. From there, we can see him moving over to Egypt to secure his grain supply and his army's food, which would then let him have a very easy position to put down the rest of the revolt. Most very ambitious Roman people who would be leading these kind of rebellions had already died in the previous civil war, which would make, again, 2 civil wars back to back. It would be much easier the second time around, where all of these places have just been defeated prior. Unfortunately for Rome, we would likely see some pushback in Germany or Britannia, where there are these big front lines against tribes, and in this time of instability, you could likely see them push forward a bit to take parts of Rome. Coming out of this, Rome would likely be a bit unstable. Again, to get a better idea of Septimus Severus, he was again an amazing general. He greatly expanded organizations like the Praetorian Guard. He paid soldiers better, but all of this came at the cost of, while yes, you have a very good military, who he can use to just, as a hammer, to just beat any enemy he has with, it's going to come at the cost of greatly debasing his currency, putting it in a situation where it's not very good, and this is going to be an issue you continue to see much further down the line, making situations like the crisis of the 3rd century hit much harder, and eventually, in part at least, being one of the economic problems that helps lead to the fall of Rome hundreds of years down the line. But, in general, while Rome may be somewhat unstable still, we have created the perfect breeding ground for industrialization. As A, we have completely gotten rid of slavery, which is going to provide that economic incentive like I was talking about earlier to begin industrializing and finding easier ways of creating products. And now the empire, while not being extremely stable, would be fairly rich and of general good position, where major advancements in scientific fields like the industrialization part of society could be made, so that this kind of revolution could happen around this time. And we can see industrialization begin to occur around the early 200s in Rome. Somewhere in the next few decades to 100 years, following the same patterns as our own timeline in the time where the steam engine was created, widely used, then the Industrial Revolution really kicked off, we could see somewhere in, again, that next couple decades to 100 years, really the massive capacity of the Industrial Revolution being reached. Now, to get this clear, there's not going to be any massive coal or steel processes like in our own timeline pretty quickly after, like things like the Bessemer steel process were created, which you're likely not going to see in Rome, as you, like I was saying earlier, would need a much better understanding of physics to get something like that. Where, yes, it's possible in the next period of time you have some great scientist who comes along out of these innovations and is able to figure out physics much better, so that things like that could happen. This might be limited to just a bunch more transportation and production means of industrialization, not necessarily those more advanced steps, maybe keeping it a bit behind, but still having it way, way further than in our own timeline. Again, we could probably see inventions like the train coming around this timeline, again, 1,500 years before our own timeline. The thing about Rome, again, is they were very big on this kind of road building, making them have this massive connected empire, which up until the final days of Rome, and even after the Roman Empire, helped keep Europe connected. Now, assuming Rome had railroads, they would almost certainly use them on a massive scale, as again, like I was saying, based on how they use their roads, they prioritized being very connected, and especially Septimus Severus would recognize this as a general and begin pushing for it very heavily if he was still alive and commanding at the time that this is all happening. This would make Rome by far the most interconnected, easily transporting goods nation in the world at this time. This means that many things like trade transporting soldiers and communicating messages would be much easier in the Roman Empire. This would allow for much easier responses with much quicker response times to things like nomadic invasions, which is what's eventually going to take down the Roman Empire. And this might also reverse the need for a splitting of the empire, as if the emperor could take a couple months, weeks in our own timeline to get from one end to the other, now it might only take a couple days. And with that, the consolidation and connection of the empire could be greatly improved. Now this is going to lead us in a situation where either A, Rome continues expanding and having this massive global presence, as now they have industrialized this much earlier, which again, I cannot understate how massive of an impact that would be. Or we could see Rome begin to collapse, as, again, at this time, the crisis of the 3rd century had been brewing. There was the debasing of currencies, like I had been talking about. Now there's going to be Christianity in charge, which would be very unpopular. And again, this would just be a very good breeding ground, not only for progress in the Industrial Revolution, but also a actual revolution or rebellion. Which means, from this point on, it would be very hard to maintain. Which, if we see a strong leader come together, like possibly a King Diocletian figure, come together, reunite Rome, Rome is set on a track to just completely dominate the world with no clear end in sight, where the only possible thing at this point, it's not any nomadic invasion, nothing like that, it's the only power that can take down Rome would be Rome itself. It would need to collapse from the inside out rather than any external pressure being what takes it down, which means it could probably easily conquer the rest of Germany, even farther into the Middle East, further into Eastern Europe, and possibly up into Scotland, where they're able to completely consolidate their gains across the empire. Or, again, on the other hand, it could just completely collapse. While, yes, this technology is available, it would only be, again, hundreds of years later in the Renaissance that it would actually be accessible by people of the time. Similar to other Roman inventions or advancements like medicine, which after Rome falls, it takes hundreds of years before inventors and scientists in the Renaissance to be able to rediscover that and make any real use of that, making steam power a relic of the past that's able to come back much quicker, again, still changing the world greatly, but in an even more unpredictable way depending on how they handle it. Again, since this is so early on, I can't make any real predictions from this point on, but what I can do is give a quick disclaimer, as again, this is a very highly unrealistic video, of course, as much of what I'm saying here where, again, the fundamental principle which makes this go from a 0 out of 10 possibility from happening to very likely possibly, depending on how events unfold, is that initial conversion to Christianity, which I gotta say would not be very likely for Septimus Severus to do, as he was a very traditional man and pushed for Rome becoming a much more traditional state, which means Christianity would not necessarily mesh with that very well and would likely not actually happen. But it is a fun idea nonetheless, and is very far from being impossible from happening. And from here, I would like to say, if you haven't liked, subscribed, or left a comment already, please do so now. At the time of recording this, I'm at 22 subscribers, which I would like to graciously thank you for, as I thought it would have taken me much longer to hit 20 subscribers, so a massive boom like this that I've seen over the last week or two is greatly appreciated. And again, looking at how much I've recorded, I'm probably going to have stolen at least 17 minutes from your life. You are now going to die 17 minutes earlier because of me. And I think that that fact alone deserves just one little like, subscribe, or comment from you. There's a ton of people who watch my videos and don't subscribe, don't leave a like, or anything, and, you know, of course, that's fine. That's just how life goes. If you, like personally speaking to you, mano a mano, could just leave a little thing, I would greatly appreciate it. It would help me grow, And if you liked this, please tell me that. Leave a comment, leave a suggestion, something of that sort for the future. And that's about it. Peace.